Your brain processes information. Neuroscientists can map every neural circuit. Physicists can explain every electrical signal firing across your synapses. But nobody, not your neurologist, not your physicist, not anyone can explain why you experience seeing the color red. Not because we lack data, not because we haven't looked hard enough, because your brain cannot in principle explain your own consciousness. This is the single greatest limit of science, and it reveals something fundamental about what science can and cannot do. By the end of this video, you'll understand why physics breaks when it tries to explain subjective experience, and what that actually means about the nature of your own mind. We can explain a lot about consciousness. We can map where in the brain consciousness appears and disappears. We can identify which neural patterns correlate with conscious experience. We can predict behavior based on brain activity. We can build machines that process information the way your brain does. But there is a difference between explaining how the brain works and explaining consciousness itself. That difference is the entire problem, and it's been hiding in plain sight for centuries. For a long time, people thought consciousness was magic. They thought your inner experience came from something non-physical, something beyond the reach of science. Then neuroscience got better. We discovered that every aspect of consciousness correlates with brain activity. Damage the brain, and consciousness changes. We found the neural correlates of consciousness. And people thought the problem was solved. We just needed to wait for the data. More brain imaging, better tools, more time. But here's where it gets interesting. After decades of better tools and more data, something became clear. We can now explain almost everything about how the brain works. We can describe the neural mechanisms of perception, memory, attention, emotion, and behavior. Yet we still cannot explain why any of it feels like anything. Why is there something it is like to be you? Why aren't you a philosophical zombie, a perfect biological copy of you that processes information identically but has no inner experience whatsoever? This question has a name. David Chalmers, a philosopher at the University of Arizona, introduced it in 1995. He called it the hard problem of consciousness. And it's the distinction that separates tractable scientific questions from something much stranger. Before Chalmers, people talked about the mind-body problem. But the hard problem is different. It's not about how mind and body relate. It's about why any physical process produces subjective experience at all. Let me show you the difference. And this matters because understanding the difference is where the entire wall appears. Scientists call some aspects of consciousness easy problems. Don't let the name fool you. They're not actually easy, but they're tractable to science. We can solve them by finding mechanisms and building explanations. Easy problem number 1. How does the brain store information? Answer: through neuroplasticity. Neurons form connections called synapses. When you learn something, proteins strengthen those connections. Different patterns of connections encode different memories. We understand the mechanism. Easy problem number 2. How does the brain focus attention? Answer: neural inhibition. Your prefrontal cortex suppresses irrelevant information. We can measure this with brain imaging. We can predict which stimuli will capture attention based on neural activity. Mechanism explained. Easy problem number 3. How does the brain coordinate different regions? Answer: neural oscillations. Different brain areas synchronize their firing patterns. We can measure these rhythms. We can see how they change during different tasks. Another mechanism explained. All of these are hard to answer. All of these require decades of research, but they are, in principle, answerable. You can explain them by describing mechanisms. You can build a computational model that replicates them. You can predict behavior from them. Now watch what happens when we try the same approach on consciousness itself. The hard problem is categorically different. Here's why. Easy problems ask, how does the brain do X? Hard problem asks, why does doing X feel like something? These are not the same question. And this difference is not a gap in our knowledge. It's a structural limit built into how explanation works. Here's what I mean. A neuroscientist can map the entire neural process of color vision. She can trace the journey from photons hitting your retina to signals traveling through your lateral geniculate nucleus to your primary visual cortex to your temporal and parietal regions. She can measure the exact pattern of neural firing that occurs when you see red. She can predict your behavior. She can build a machine that processes color information the same way. Complete description. Every mechanism identified. And at the end of all this, at the end of complete explanation of every neural mechanism, one question remains unanswered. One question that no mechanism can answer. Why does red look red? Why does it feel the way it does to you? Why isn't the entire process happening unconsciously, without any felt quality whatsoever? This gap between objective description and subjective experience is called the explanatory gap. And here's the crucial part. It's not a gap in our current knowledge. It's a structural gap. It exists in the logic of explanation itself. Notice something. You cannot close this gap by adding more data. You can't close it by building better brain imaging. You can't close it by mapping more neurons. Why? Because the gap is not between what we know and what we don't know. The gap is between two different kinds of facts, objective facts and subjective facts. And no amount of objective information can become subjective information. They're different categories. Think about that for a moment. This is not a limitation of neuroscience. This is science discovering its own edge. Frank Jackson, a philosopher at the Australian National University, introduced a thought experiment in 1982. It's called Mary's Room, and it makes this structural gap undeniable. Here's the setup. Mary is a brilliant neuroscientist. She has spent her entire life inside a black and white room. She has never seen colors, never. But she has access to all the scientific information about color vision. She knows every wavelength of light. She knows the exact physics of how photons interact with matter. She knows every detail of how cones in the retina respond to different wavelengths. She knows the complete neural architecture of color processing. She knows every neural pattern that corresponds to every color. She knows all the equations, all the data, all the objective facts. She has complete physical knowledge of color vision. Then one day, the door of the room opens. Mary walks out into the world and sees red for the first time, sees it, actually experiences it. Now here's the question that breaks physicalism. Does she learn something new? Your intuition screams yes. Of course she does. She learns what red looks like. She learns the felt quality of seeing red. She gains new knowledge. But wait. According to physicalism, the view that everything is ultimately physical, she shouldn't learn anything new. She already knew all the physical facts. All of them. If physical facts are all the facts that exist, then she should have known everything there is to know. Complete knowledge. But she didn't. There was something missing from her complete physical knowledge. That something is the subjective character of seeing red, what philosophers call qualia, the felt quality, the what it is like-ness. This reveals something devastating. Physical facts alone do not exhaust all facts. There is something about consciousness that physical description cannot capture. Now, you might say, maybe Mary didn't actually learn a new fact. Maybe she just learned it in a different way. She knew the information before. Now she's accessing the same information through experience instead of through reading. But that doesn't work. Here's why. If that were true, then all facts would be the same fact accessed different ways. But that's clearly false. Mary knew the fact, wavelength 700 nanometers triggers a certain pattern of neural firing. That fact didn't change. What changed is whether she experienced that pattern. Before, she didn't. After, she did. Those are different facts. One is objective, one is subjective. And no amount of knowing the objective fact forces the subjective fact to exist. Think about this carefully. This is the hard problem made concrete. And it shows that consciousness cannot reduce to physics the way heat reduces to molecular motion. Maybe consciousness is just information processing. After all, your brain is doing massive computation, billions of neurons each making decisions based on input. The whole system computes outcomes. Maybe consciousness is nothing more than that computation happening. But here's where this breaks down. A computer processes information the exact same way your brain does. Input, processing, output. Billions of logical operations per second. We can build a computer that has the identical functional organization as your brain, same number of computational elements, same connectivity, same input-output relationships. The computer would behave identically. It would be a perfect functional duplicate. So I need to ask you directly, would that computer be conscious? Would it have inner experience? There is no fact about the computation that determines the answer. The computation itself is purely objective. You can describe every bit of it, you can run it, you can measure its behavior, you can predict its responses, all objective, all measurable. But consciousness is not a property that emerges from computation in any way we can identify or measure. A system could have identical functional organization and either be conscious or not conscious. There is no computational property that forces consciousness to exist. This is not a gap in our understanding of computation. This is the structure of computation itself. Computation is objective. It produces objective properties. Consciousness is subjective. Computation does not force subjectivity. This is sometimes called the philosophical zombie problem. A zombie, in philosophy, is not a dead person who comes back to life. It's a hypothetical being that is physically and functionally identical to a conscious person but has no inner experience. It processes information. It responds to stimuli. It even reports that it's conscious. I have feelings, the zombie says, but there's nothing it is like to be a zombie. No felt quality behind any of its processes. Now, you might think zombies are impossible. You might think that once you make something functionally identical to a human brain, consciousness automatically emerges. But there is no physical law that requires this. There is no mechanism that forces consciousness to exist just because computation is happening. This is the hard problem restated in computational terms. Functional organization, by itself, is insufficient for consciousness. And this reveals something crucial about the limits of computation itself. Here's where things get precise. I need to show you why this is not just a hard problem. It's a structural problem. Physicalism is the view that everything that exists is ultimately physical. There are no non-physical substances or properties. Everything reduces to physics. The physicalist strategy for consciousness is straightforward. Step 1, consciousness is produced by the brain. Step 2, the brain is physical. Step 3, therefore consciousness is physical. Step 4, we can explain consciousness by explaining neural mechanisms. Done. But this strategy breaks down at a logical point, not an empirical point, a logical point. The reduction doesn't work. And here's why. Every successful reduction in science has the same structure. Heat reduces to molecular motion. You can fully explain heat by understanding how molecules move. Genes reduce to DNA sequences. You can fully understand inheritance by understanding DNA. Liquidity reduces to molecular structure. All of these reductions work because both levels of description are objective. Both are third person. Both describe properties you can measure from the outside. You can translate between them completely. But consciousness cannot reduce this way. Here's the structural problem. Subjective experience is not an objective property. You cannot translate between objective description and subjective experience. No translation bridge exists. Why? Because translation requires that both things be the same kind of thing. Objective facts are third-person facts. Subjective facts are first-person facts. They are different categories. This is not a limitation of current neuroscience. This is a logical limit. It stems from the difference between objective and subjective description itself. Thomas Nagel, a philosopher at New York University, made this point in a famous paper in 1974 titled, "What is it like to be a bat?" He argued that consciousness has an irreducibly subjective character. There is something it is like to be you. There is something it is like to be a bat. But from an objective, third-person perspective, you can never fully capture what it is like to be anything. You can describe behaviors, you can describe mechanisms, you can measure neural correlates, but you cannot capture the first-person perspective from the third-person viewpoint. It's not a matter of insufficient data, it's a matter of category difference. This is the core of the hard problem. Subjective experience has a first-person property. Objective science only provides third-person properties. These are fundamentally different categories. You cannot bridge this gap by collecting more data or building better instruments. The gap is logical, not empirical. Notice what this means. Science will never solve the hard problem. Not because science is young, not because we lack the right tools yet, because this is what science is. Science describes the objective world. Consciousness is subjective. These are different categories of description. Let me isolate the question that everything depends on. Is consciousness hard to explain because we don't have enough information, or is it hard to explain because objective description cannot, in principle, capture it? If consciousness is a data problem, then science will eventually solve it. We just need more brain imaging, better recording technologies, more time, more research. The information is there. We haven't found it yet, but we will. But look at what happened. We have more data now than ever. Brain imaging technology has exploded. We can record from thousands of neurons simultaneously. We can map neural circuits at unprecedented resolution. And yet the hard problem remains exactly as hard as it was in 1995. Why? Because getting more objective data does not create subjective data. Objective information cannot become subjective information. These are different things. All the evidence suggests this is not a data problem. This is a category problem. It's not that we lack information. It's that no amount of objective information can capture subjective experience. This is a logical problem, not an empirical one. Here's an analogy that shows the difference. Imagine a camera. The camera is perfect. It can measure every objective property of color, wavelengths, reflectance patterns, RGB values, frequency spectra, every single objective property. But the camera never sees color. The camera has no visual experience. You cannot fix this by building a better camera or measuring more properties. The camera, by its nature, captures objective properties. It cannot capture subjective experience. This is not a limitation of current cameras. This is a logical limitation of how cameras work. Similarly, objective description, whether it comes from neuroscience, physics, or any other science, captures objective properties. It cannot capture subjective experience. Not because we lack better tools, because subjective experience is not an objective property. Let me be absolutely clear about what this means. We can describe the neural correlates of consciousness. We can identify which brain states correspond to which experiences. We can build predictive models that work brilliantly. We can explain behavior. All of this is genuine scientific knowledge. All of this is true. But none of it explains why those brain states produce consciousness instead of occurring unconsciously. That gap is not a gap in our knowledge. That gap reflects the difference between objective and subjective description itself. And this brings us to the largest consequence. Physics is the science of objective properties: mass, charge, momentum, force, energy. These are properties you can measure from the outside. They are third person. They don't depend on anyone's subjective experience to exist. A planet has mass whether or not anyone observes it. Consciousness is fundamentally first person. It depends on subjective experience. There is something it is like to be you right now. But here's what this requires logically. There is no objective property that determines whether that subjective experience exists. A physical system could have identical objective properties and either be conscious or not conscious. Think about what that means. Consciousness is real. You're experiencing it right now. But consciousness is not an objective property. It cannot be described in the language of physics because the language of physics only describes objective properties. This reveals a fundamental truth. Physics is complete for the objective world, but the objective world does not exhaust reality. Consciousness is part of reality. But consciousness is not something physics can describe. This is not because physics is incomplete. This is because consciousness is not an objective property in the way physics describes properties. Now, what does this mean for how we understand consciousness? There are three logical possibilities. None of them are comfortable. First possibility, revisionism. Maybe consciousness is not a genuine feature of reality. Maybe it's an illusion. Maybe what we call subjective experience is just the brain's way of organizing information, and there's no hard problem because there's nothing to explain. Daniel Dennett, a philosopher at Tufts University, has defended this position. He argues that qualia subjective qualities don't actually exist in the way we think they do. If this is true, the hard problem disappears because the thing we're trying to explain isn't real. But this requires denying something you know to be true, your own experience. Second possibility, physicalism with radical revision. Consciousness is physical, but physics is incomplete. Not just incomplete in the way all science is incomplete, but incomplete in principle, radically. Physics needs fundamental rethinking. Maybe consciousness is a basic feature of the physical world, like space or time. Maybe every particle has some form of consciousness. Maybe consciousness cannot be reduced to anything simpler. This is called panpsychism. It's gaining defenders among serious philosophers, but it requires abandoning the physicalist dream of a unified reductive explanation. Third possibility, consciousness is not reducible to physics. It's a fundamental feature of reality that cannot be explained in physical terms. This doesn't mean consciousness is non-physical in the supernatural sense. It just means consciousness is a basic feature of reality, not derived from anything else. We can describe its correlates with the brain, but the consciousness itself is what it is. It exists as a fundamental fact. All three positions have serious defenders. All three require abandoning something. None has won. Physics has reached the boundary of what objective description can explain. And that boundary is exactly where consciousness begins. Scientists and philosophers have proposed many theories of consciousness. Let me show you why each one faces the same structural problem. Integrated information theory says consciousness equals integrated information. The more a system integrates information across its parts, the more conscious it is. You can measure this precisely. It's a mathematical quantity. The theory makes predictions, but it faces the hard problem directly. Why should integrated information feel like something? Why should a system that integrates information be conscious instead of doing the same integration unconsciously? The theory describes the mechanism, but the consciousness is unexplained. Global workspace theory says consciousness happens when information is broadcast to multiple systems in the brain. Information in the global workspace becomes available to multiple cognitive processes simultaneously. This is objective. You can measure it. But again, why does broadcasting information feel like something? Why is being broadcast to multiple systems different from being processed privately in terms of felt quality? The mechanism is described, the consciousness is not. Some physicists and philosophers, including Roger Penrose at Oxford and Stuart Hameroff at Arizona, have proposed that consciousness requires quantum processes. Maybe consciousness emerges from quantum collapse in microtubules inside neurons. But even if consciousness does require quantum processes, explaining the mechanism does not explain why that mechanism produces consciousness instead of happening unconsciously. Every theory runs into the same wall. Every single one. And this is not a failure of current theories. This is evidence that the hard problem might not be solvable within the framework of objective science at all. Let me tell you what this actually means. You began this video hearing that your brain cannot explain your own consciousness. By now, you understand something deeper, something you cannot unsee. Your brain cannot explain your consciousness because consciousness is not a property that objective description, physical or otherwise, can capture. This is not a gap in physics. This is the boundary of physics. Physics is true. It describes the objective world perfectly. Every objective fact about the brain is real. The neural correlates of consciousness are real. The mechanisms are real. But you are not purely objective. Your subjective experience is real, and it escapes the net of physics. That's not a limitation of physics. That's a truth about what you are. What does this mean practically? First, it means your consciousness is genuinely private. No amount of neuroscience can fully understand your subjective experience from the outside. Scientists can measure what's happening in your brain. They can predict your behavior. They can correlate neural patterns with experiences, but they cannot access what it feels like to be you. Not because they lack data, because there is no objective data that captures subjective experience. The privacy is structural, not practical. Second, it means that the scientific method, for all its power, has a boundary. The boundary is exactly where consciousness begins. Science can describe how consciousness correlates with the physical world. Science can identify mechanisms. Science cannot explain consciousness itself. Not because science is young, not because we lack better theories, because this is what science is. Science describes the objective world. Consciousness is subjective. These are different categories. No amount of scientific progress can cross a logical boundary. Third, it means consciousness is something about reality that physics cannot in principle solve. Not because we lack theories, because the tools of physics are designed to describe objective properties, and consciousness is fundamentally subjective. This is not a limitation of physics. This is science discovering its own edge. Here's what matters. Your consciousness, the felt quality of your experience right now, in this moment, cannot be captured by any objective description, no matter how detailed or mathematically sophisticated. The redness of red, the pain of pain, the joy of joy, the weight of sadness. These subjective qualities are not objective properties. They cannot be derived from physics. They cannot be explained by mechanisms. They simply are what they are, and they are real. You are, in the most literal sense, something that science cannot fully explain, not because we lack data, not because we haven't tried hard enough, but because the tools of science objective description cannot capture subjective experience. That is not a limitation of science. That is something true about you. Your consciousness is the one fact about the universe that physics cannot solve. And when you understand why, when you see the logical wall that objective description hits when it encounters subjectivity, you cannot unsee it. You cannot go back to thinking consciousness is just complicated computation. You cannot go back to thinking physics will eventually explain subjective experience. You cannot unsee the category difference between objective and subjective description. Your consciousness, the inner life you're living right now, is something that escapes physics entirely, not mysteriously, logically, and perhaps that is exactly as it should be.